Shall call on the Honorable Leader of the Opposition to say prayers.
Let us pray. Almighty God, from whom all wisdom and power derive, we beseech thee so to direct and prosper the deliberations of the Legislative Assembly now assembled, that all things may be ordered upon the best and surest foundation for the glory of thy name and for the safety, honor, and welfare of the people of these islands. Bless our sovereign lady, Queen Elizabeth II, Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, Charles, Prince of Wales, and all the royal family. Give grace to all who exercise authority in our Commonwealth, that peace and happiness, truth and justice, religion and piety may be established among us. Especially we pray for the Governor of our islands, the Premier, the Speaker of the Legislative Assembly, the Leader of the Opposition, Ministers of the Cabinet, ex officio members and members of the Legislative Assembly, that we may be enabled faithfully to perform the responsible duties of our high office. All this we ask for thy great name's sake. Let us say the Lord's Prayer together. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. The Lord bless us and keep us. The Lord make his face shine upon us and be gracious unto us. The Lord lift up the light of his countenance upon us and give us peace now and always. Amen.
Please be seated. This Honorable Legislative Assembly now resumes its sitting.
Administration of oaths or affirmations.
None.
Reading by the Honorable Speaker of messages and announcements.
None.
Presentation of petitions.
None.
Presentation of papers and of reports.
None.
Questions to Honorable Ministers and members of the Cabinet.
None.
Statements by the Honorable Ministers and members of the Cabinet.
None.
Personal explanations.
None.
Obituary and other ceremonial speeches.
None.
Raising of matter of privileges.
None.
Government business. Bills. Second reading. The referendum, people-initiated referendum regarding the Port Bill 2019.
Continuation of debate. Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? Last call. Does any other member, the member from Georgetown West?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for giving me the opportunity to rise and speak and make a few contributions to the people-initiated referendum regarding the Port Bill 2019. I am privileged to be able to address this Honorable House concerning this nationally important issue. The balance and success of our country's broader economy may very well be determined by the actions taken under this unity government over the last several years. I am proud to be able to say I support this cruise berthing and enhanced cargo facility, both of which stand to improve and secure the growth in multiple industries for the foreseeable future. Over recent years, I have attended many meetings and presentations in order to get as much information as possible. Many of these were open to the public, and I attended to learn as much as I could and to get the public feedback firsthand. Mr. Speaker, I have never done anything or been a part of a party or group that has done anything to harm Cayman or the Caymanian people, and I do not intend to start now. The Deputy Premier and our government has made it clear to me and to the public that if there was any chance of any damage to the 7 Mile Beach, then we would not be having this debate. From before the preferred bidder was announced in July 2019, I have been constantly approached, messaged, and received calls encouraging me to tell the Premier and the Deputy Premier to sign the contract and just build the cruise berthing facility and cargo port. Last week, while I was off island, I received 2 emails, and I explained that I was off island and I would speak to them when I came back. And then I've received, one more this morning, so it'll be 12, Saturday, Sunday, and today. 11, now 12 emails urging me to vote to put off the referendum date until 2020. Based on the number who have contacted me in support compared to the number who have contacted me against, if I am to make a decision based on the feedback I get personally, and I'm not talking about when I read postings on Facebook, because that's just public and it's not coming to me from my constituents, then I have to vote yes in support of this current referendum bill. But I also have to make my decision based on my conscience, and after considering all the information I have gathered, I come to the conclusion that I will be voting yes. The merits of this project have been weighed and debated by everyone here, not only over the last 2 days, but for several years. Much of what has been said by those who have been lobbying against this project have been grossly misrepresented to the people, and that needs to be corrected. I often hear those opposing the port stating that Cayman must choose quality over quantity. Mr. Speaker, the very saying itself is grossly flawed on many levels. Cruise tourism itself is based on volume. Even the smaller, older ships have a much larger capacity than any of the hotels operating in Cayman. A small ship by today's standards will bring a minimum of 2,000 passengers, while on an average, most of the ships that call into Georgetown will be closer to 3,000 or 4,000 passengers. By comparison, the Ritz-Carlton, our largest hotel, has 363 rooms. Cruise tourism is quite different than any other businesses because not only can you target the quality customers, they also come with quantity, giving us the best of both worlds. The Oasis of the Seas and its sister ships are the crown jewels of the Royal Caribbean and consistently carry a demographic with higher disposable income. These ships have a capacity of 2,700 rooms. Our big 4 hotels, the Ritz-Carlton, Westin, Marriott, and Kimpton, have a joint capacity of 1,244 rooms, or less than half of the capacity of one Oasis-class ship. Mr. Speaker, again, I present to you that the idea of having to make a choice of quality versus quantity when it comes to cruise tourism is a complete misconception, and unfortunately, Cayman is not even able to make this choice for quality because these ships sail past us weekly and will continue to do so until a berthing facility is built. Speaking about quality and quantity naturally leads me into the discussion of another often misrepresented concept: the carrying capacity of our island. Those trying to hinder the progress of our country have been using the total number of cruise ships passengers per year as a measuring stick to say that Cayman cannot handle any more cruise tourists. In doing so, they conveniently omit the fact that these ships are only here for the day. The real idea of carrying capacity is only valid when we measure it as it actually happens, and that is on a daily basis. By building the cruise berthing facility and spreading the arrivals of the cruise ships over the week, we can easily increase the total passengers per year while creating a stable, even manageable daily schedule. When we speak of carrying capacity, those who oppose the port seem to assume that we are victims of our tourism industry. They seem to believe that cruise tourism is something that happens to us. They seem to believe that we do not have a place at the table to design and thoughtfully develop how our tourism works. Mr. Michael Bailey, CEO of Royal Caribbean, when he was here just a couple weeks ago, met with industry and said that the key to a great guest experience, balanced with the needs of Cayman as a destination, is intelligent conversation, bringing all parties to the table, working together to make the most informed, intelligent decisions. He also pointed out that the newer, larger ships in his company carry passengers with an average of over 20% higher disposable income than those on the smaller ships in his company. These larger ships are passing us by as long as we are not able to provide a berth for them. Mr. Speaker, we have long talked about the two pillars of our economy, tourism and finance. Our tourism industry has two pillars itself, cruise tourism and stayover tourism. But unlike our two main pillars, these two are undeniably linked. Our finance industry is very important to our economy, and we must protect it. But we are heavily dependent on outside influences, where our tourism industry is largely in our own hands. Mr. Speaker, it has been documented that as much as 6% of those who visit by cruise return to our islands as coveted stayover guests. While 6% may sound insignificant, when you factor that across 1.9 million cruise tourists, as we saw last year in 2018, it equates to 114,000 people. Those are 114,000 people that will return in the future to book hotel rooms, eat at restaurants, take tours, and spend money across the entire island. Mr. Speaker, while it is a known fact that cruise and stayover tourism are joined, it is not just a statistic. Just this past Friday night, as I returned home, I sat next to a couple from Michigan on the plane. Without telling them that I was a member of the government, I asked them what was bringing them to Cayman. The husband proceeded to tell me he had originally visited Cayman on a cruise ship by himself. And in his words, it was far too short. But even with this brief visit, he loved his experience so much that right there he decided that he had to bring his wife back, and they are enjoying a vacation at the Sunshine Suites as I speak here today. And Mr. Speaker, I just want to say that I was sitting in 29D, and a man in 30C touched me on my shoulder and asked me if I would change seats with him so he could sit by his wife. So I am taking that as a blessing to prove my point that cruise ship passengers, some of them return as stayover passengers, just emphasizing what I'm saying there. The choice is not to pick cruise or stayover versus the other. We need them both. We need the proper balance of both to satisfy the wide range of jobs and capabilities of Caymanian workers today and for the future. Any attempt to say that we must choose one over the other will result in a decline in our tourism as a whole. Another thing, Mr. Speaker, I would like to discuss here is the blatant distortion by the CPR anti-port lobbyists of the financing and costs associated with this project. If we use the 2.3 million passengers estimated in the PwC report, even with the portion of head tax conceded to Verdant Isle, the government in total will end up with almost $20 million more in revenue over the next 25 years. I can say this because even though the total revenue from head tax to government would be around 11 million less than we receive now, the Port Authority will increase their revenue by $30 million. If we indeed do reach 2.5 million passengers, as was projected by Verdant Isle, over the next 25 years, our government will be receiving 39 million more, plus another 45 million to the Port Authority for a combined total of $84 million. So in fact, not only will our government not be losing money as the opponents would like you to believe, Mr. Speaker, we as a people will have a much larger revenue to fund other important needs like education, health care, taking care of the elderly, and building other important infrastructure for the entire island. Mr. Speaker, it isn't as if I have said thus far isn't enough. The biggest point I will make now, as I have listened to the ongoing debate regarding the cruise berthing and enhanced cargo facility over the last few weeks and months, I am struck and deeply saddened by the understatement and in some cases complete avoidance of the crucial point, which is our cruise tourism industry is dominated by Caymanians. Mr. Speaker, cruise tourism is a Caymanian industry. For over 40 years, Caymanians have been hosting our cruise guests and making their stay here special. For those of us who grew up snorkeling and swimming and enjoying our islands, jobs in this industry are as close to our culture as you can get. For those in the room that like statistics, here are some. 70% of jobs in cruise tourism are held by Caymanians, with approximately 4,500 people working in cruise tourism. That means 3,150 Caymanians. Compare that with just over 30% in stayover. Mr. Speaker, the cruise lines have been very clear in their forecasts for arrivals if we do not have cruise berthing facility. They will not tender their new, bigger ships that carry the most affluent passengers. They have said it over and over again, and to not pay them mind is pure folly. They could not have been clearer about it. So as the older ships are decommissioned, we will lose our cruise industry. That, Mr. Speaker, is the harsh truth. The business case estimated that arrivals will be reduced by half, or basically 1 million passengers a year. I would expect all of you in this room to remember the recent lean times for our industry when cruise arrivals were that low. People were genuinely suffering. It is a terrible feeling to not be able to provide for your family. To those who oppose this project, I ask, where are we going to find more than 1,500 jobs to replace those that will be lost? What are we going to do with all those people, our people? Mr. Speaker, now let's talk about the opportunities for more Caymanians to get into cruise tourism as business owners or employees when the cruise berthing facility is built. It is ironic that the people in Georgetown, Central, Bordentown, East End, and North Side have the most to gain from the economic opportunities this vital piece of infrastructure will bring. And the members from these areas are the ones fighting hardest against it. Are they really for the people, or are they only for being contrary? Think of it this way. If cruise passengers are not required to line up for hours to get off the ship in the morning, and then line up again for hours in the scorching sun or the driving rain to get back on the ship, they could take advantage of tours, attractions further afield than 7 Mile Beach and Stingray City. Having a market like this is a gold mine for any entrepreneurial Caymanian, and yet those sitting across the room want to take that market away. How can they be for the people? For generations, Caymanians have worked hard to improve ourselves and our lot in life. We have incredible legacy to share with future generations. We are the envy of our neighbors in the Caribbean and indeed around the world. What do we not have yet is a modern port. And when I say port, I mean a modern berth and cargo facility. Our existing infrastructure is falling to pieces. It has reached the end of its useful life. It needs to be upgraded. I do not have to remind anyone here, Mr. Speaker, that Cayman is an island nation. Our every need comes in through our port. My hat is off to our farmers and the growth of agriculture in Cayman, but it will never, ever be sustainable. How can we survive? How can we survive if our port is crumbling into the sea? Why must we all pay extra for our goods because bigger ships cannot call here? Mr. Speaker, I remember in the late 70s, during the 80s and the early 90s, I was working with the Georgetown Eddie Ebanks and Dale Ramon as a customs clearer for Rembro, R.E. McTaggart and Brothers, which is by right Treasure Cove, Bada Shoes, Thompson Garage. And in those days, we thought the cargo coming in was unbelievable. Now, it is incredible. It's increasing all the time. I was on the dock the day that the ship roll on, roll off. The first one came to Cayman. I was right there when the back of that ship laid the tail down. And from that, it's increased, and it continues to increase. We will be getting a cargo port, free. Our cargo will multiply to satisfy the needs of Cayman, and we will be getting a cargo port free. The government has negotiated an incredible deal for our people. Not only do we secure the future of the cruise tourism industry long into the future, but we are not cash out of pocket for it to be built. There will be no upland development, which means that Caymanian entrepreneurs and their employees are the recipients of all the passengers spent on island, and we are finally able to intelligently plan our cruise tourism operations to provide a better experience for our guests, as well as to solve some of our most pressing problems, like congestion and too many people in one place at a time. And let's not forget the other big one. We get a cargo port thrown in. How long would we need to wait before we had the cash to pay for that out of pocket? Mr. Speaker, in my opinion, this project is a win-win, except, of course, for those who have different agendas. I cannot help but observe that those who are most vehemently opposed to the project are looking at it from a point of privilege. If the opponents of this project are the wealthiest amongst us, who is looking out for the working class? I campaigned under a manifesto that clearly supported this project. I campaigned on supporting opportunities for Caymanians to make a good living and to improve their lives. I made a promise to the people in my constituency that I would uphold my responsibility to deliver on that manifesto. I consider that manifesto my promise. Mr. Speaker, everyone has their own opinion, and I do not take that away from anyone, but I have my opinion. And that is why I vote aye to this bill, and on December the 19th, I will be at the polls voting yes. Yes for cruise tourism, yes for lower price cargo goods, and yes for Caymanian employment. And I encourage all Caymanians to do so. I thank you, Mr. Speaker, for giving me the time to speak.
Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? Last call. The member from Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker. 29% of the people that I represent in Prospect signed the cruise port petition. 29% after an entire year of canvassing by the CPR group. Not an immaterial number, Mr. Speaker, but hardly a majority, wouldn't you say? It suggests to me, Mr. Speaker, that from the Prospect perspective, the majority either support the cruise port berthing facility, or it doesn't rank high enough on their list of priorities. Things like healthcare, education, traffic, Mr. Speaker. I know from listening to my constituents in Prospect and by extension Red Bay, when they speak, the number one issue on their mind is traffic. And for some of them, it's an issue of national importance. But we aren't here today to discuss traffic, Mr. Speaker. 29% is also very telling, Mr. Speaker, particularly against the backdrop of all of the criticism in which I have received personally on this subject. As all will recall and often will repeat, I ran in 2017 on a campaign against the cruise port in a constituency who by those numbers clearly supported the port. Yet they elected me anyway. Guess they liked my other political ideas and plans for the way forward more than they cared about my opinions about the port. Things like cleaner and safer streets, Mr. Speaker, better roads with better lighting, reduced stress in the morning commute. All things that I am proud to say have been delivered to Prospect over the past 2 years by this administration and by the hard work of yours truly. And despite that success, Mr. Speaker, some of the loudest voices in this debate against the port, some regrettably from this very room, have resorted to saying things like Prospect deserves better. Ironically, and I suppose thankfully, Mr. Speaker, these critiques come from people who reside outside of Prospect, thus proving once again, ignorance is bliss. By my count, Mr. Speaker, Prospect is doing just fine. And with more community enhancements still to come, both in Prospect and our shared boundary partner, Red Bay, Prospect is positioned nicely to continue to flourish, exactly according to plans. And we are supported by hardworking and committed members of the Prospect and Red Bay Community Group who want what I want, Mr. Speaker, the very best for Prospect and Red Bay. Mr. Speaker, when I became MLA with responsibility for Prospect in May 2017, one of my closest advisors and friends came to me and said something that has remained with me these past 2 years. He said, "Austin, sometimes you are going to have to get used to the fact of people not liking you and being very vocal in their dislike. Pay it no mind, my son. It's par for the course," he said. "You are only considered an honorable man after you demit office, not the other way around. Stay true to your convictions, hold your ground." Sage advice, Mr. Speaker. And advice, as I said, has stuck with me, and I intend to do just that. Convictions, Mr. Speaker. My convictions, or should I say my previous convictions, has proven themselves to be the ammunition with which my critics have elected to use against me on this issue of the cruise berthing and port facility project. I guess it's another example that one should be careful what they say, lest those words be used against you. And in particular, Mr. Speaker, what has garnered the most criticisms is my change of convictions or viewpoint on this project since that fateful day in September 2018, during the first meeting of the 2018-2019 session, the state opening of this honorable house, which was held in our beautiful Cayman-Brac. Mr. Speaker, from a podium similar, if not identical to this one, I painstakingly took the time to outline my views and why they had changed. Over the course of the past year, those views have been distorted by lies and confusion intentionally brought about by the CPR group and their leadership muppets. And chaos has become the order of the day, proudly funded by private donors with commercial or political interests, not so much national interests, Mr. Speaker. And to be clear, I refer in a derogatory manner, admittedly, only to the persons I define as the leadership muppets. Not all of them. As a matter of fact, it's really only two people, Mr. Speaker, in all of this that have really gotten on my nerves. It certainly isn't the 5,000 citizens who signed the petition, 29% of which call Prospect home. I haven't heard their voices on the radio. It's really just two people, Mr. Speaker. But I will speak to them in a moment. Oh, I have taken some licks, Mr. Speaker, make no doubt about it. But I haven't interfered with those licks. I haven't attempted to defend myself, not because I can't, but because I chose not to interrupt the democratic process. But I promised myself, Mr. Speaker, as God is my witness above, they would not escape my glance, not in this place. Otherwise, I wouldn't feel good about myself. But I will be honest, Mr. Speaker, the CPR group, many of whom either are or were my friends, have to consider how gullible they have been to have allowed two rotten apples to spoil the bunch. After all, the CPR group have gone from saying, "We don't oppose the port, we just want more information," to now, "Down with the port, no matter what the cost, no matter what the information may be, vote No. Despite, Mr. Speaker, the plethora of information that has been shared on this cruise berthing and port facility project since the preferred bidder was announced, which has included a dedicated website containing all of government's information, FAQs, reports, etc. A visit from Virgin Isle partners themselves who did the media rounds while also meeting with the government and key stakeholders. They tried to meet with the opposition and the CPR group, but they refused. Clearly, again, another example that it is not information they want, but it is demands they wish to make. But despite all of this effort, Mr. Speaker, we still find ourselves at this crossroads. Today, debating the referendum bill that will take us to the referendum vote day on December 19th, 2019. And once again, Mr. Speaker, I rise to outline why my views have changed, Mr. Speaker. Not so much to address the critics who frankly will never be satisfied. Their only mission is to stop or frustrate this project to the point of stopping. But instead, Mr. Speaker, my focus today primarily will seek to focus on that 29%, which admittedly represents persons who call Prospect home. Many of whom, I believe, have been misled by this single-minded CPR group, while others may yet indeed have some legitimate concerns. It will be my goal, Mr. Speaker, to relieve those concerns here today by sharing what I have learned in the last 2 years that has changed my mind to the point that I now support the cruise berthing and port facility as is being proposed. However, before doing so, Mr. Speaker, I must address some of the comments made by two individuals who I will be naming in this honorable House as none other than Mr. Johan Moxham and Mario Rankin. Oddly enough, two persons, if it wasn't for me and Cayman Crosstalk when it was worth listening to, no one would even know their names. So I suppose it's my own fault, Mr. Speaker. I have always maintained, Mr. Speaker, whether in my former life or in this one, that we do not always have to agree in order to have a good conversation. As a matter of fact, we are likely to learn more from each other when we agree to disagree. But these two individuals, Mr. Speaker, have repeatedly made this cruise referendum conversation far too personal. They have criticized and demonized anyone who shares an opinion contrary to their own narrow view. Me more than anyone. And have often referred to me and some of my colleagues, also newcomers to this legislative role, as pigeons, Kool-Aid drinkers, and uneducated. What about them, Mr. Speaker, I ask? Two individuals who, like many in this House today, are claiming to be lily white, were once upon a time also supporters in the concept of cruise berthing. But unlike those in this House, Mr. Speaker, not only were they supporters, Mr. Speaker, but you know, and I know, that they both hoped to position that support into some form of pecuniary advantage. And we will leave it there. In the words of another one of my social media critics, Mr. Speaker, when the money was good, their opinions were different. And history, as they say, has a tendency to repeat itself. Because once again, thanks to the CPR donors, the money was good, and their opinion is yet again different. Who is worse, Mr. Speaker, I ask? The individual who changes his mind when he is presented with new information versus the one who changes his mind in return for financial benefit. Which one of these would you rather have as your representative? I leave that question for members to ponder. In the past, Mr. Speaker, I stood against the wholesale slaughter of our marine environment. I stood against upland development that would create infrastructure that would compete against local merchants and businesses while also threatening 7 Mile Beach, our bread and butter in tourism. And most of all, Mr. Speaker, I stood against borrowing and future debt burdens for this country as a result of building this massive infrastructure project. So what has changed, Mr. Speaker? Well, unless you've been living under a rock for the last 2 years, quite a lot has changed. Put simply, Mr. Speaker, the cruise berthing and port facility that I debated so passionately in the past is not the same cruise project that has been offered up under this administration by the Honorable Deputy Premier and with the support of this coalition government. It is an entirely different project from top to bottom, and one that has taken into account the recent past 10 years of conversation on this topic, Mr. Speaker, my conversations, if not the past 25 years of conversation on this topic, and has produced a concept that we all can and should get behind. Mr. Speaker, the cruise berthing and port facility project as proposed will deliver world-class infrastructure at no cost to the public purse. No borrowing, no debt, no financing charges, no guarantees, all risk carried by the cruise lines themselves, both to build it, to finance it, and to maintain it over the life of its existence. The Deputy Premier and the member from Georgetown West recently attended the Florida Caribbean Cruise Association meeting held in Puerto Rico, I believe. And as I'm told, every Caribbean island, every premier, every leader of Minister of Tourism, everybody wanted to get 5 minutes with the Cayman team. Why? Because they wanted to find out how it is that the Cayman Islands were able to broker a deal that is entirely different than any other port development project has been throughout the rest of the Caribbean for the reasons that I have outlined. That sort of thing makes me proud, Mr. Speaker. Proud of my 2 colleagues for the job they did, but proud more importantly because the Cayman Islands are once again becoming leaders in our region. That shining beacon that guides the actions and activities of the rest of the region. Not bad for a 76 square mile island. 102. Can't live out the sister islands. Thank you very much. Only counting Grand Cayman. Good point. 102. Especially in the front bench. It is a project, Mr. Speaker, that will deliver a new design that will mitigate against unnecessary environmental destruction by reducing the overall dredge volume by 31% and decreasing the total dredge footprint by 11%. Other key environmental features include a 20% reduction on the overall environmental impact from the previous plans, with 30% of the coral removed being relocated as part of a successful partnership between Verdant Isle Partners and Polaris Applied Sciences, who, as the Premier noted have already achieved success between 2016 and 2017, relocating large sections of limestone and damaged corals in both West Bay and at Eden Rock, Georgetown, as a result, I might add, of cruise ship damage. Mr. Sergeant, I'll call upon you to remind those in the gallery that they are here to watch but not to engage those on the floor. And Mr. Speaker, I would like to correct...
Honorable member,
Yes, sir.
I am taking careful note that there are visitors to our gallery that normally don't come, and they will not know the rules. I did mention some of the rules yesterday, and I'll remind those that come, because there are some that comes at times, that they are not to try to engage members in the chamber.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Sergeant for yesterday enforcing those rules. And I will only add that the faces who are in the gallery, who I welcome, they're citizens of this country, and by all means, we encourage persons to participate in our democracy. But we can't use the excuse that they are unaware because they were here yesterday, and those rules were repeated to them yesterday. But some like to push their luck. Mr. Speaker, I would like to correct statements made yesterday by the Leader of the Opposition, who stated in his contribution, and I quote, that Cayman loves to be first to attempt coral relocation and to be successful at it. It's unfortunate that he's not in the room right now, but that's okay. That's right. His colleagues are here. I'm sure they'll repeat it to him. The truth of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition is about 2 decades behind in the news. Coral reef restoration and management techniques are in ever-increasing demand as a result of the global decline in coral reefs worldwide. Coral transplantation, Mr. Speaker, has greatly increased in the past 2 decades in numerous locations across the globe. 19 locations, Mr. Speaker, to be specific. Cursory search of Google will reveal this, but again, persons who have opposed this project are not interested in information, not interested in facts. 19 locations have explored and are engaging in some form or the other in coral relocation or transplantation across the globe. They are the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, Mauritius, Tanzania, the Seychelles, the Maldives, Jordan, Israel, Hawaii, Japan, Taiwan, Mexico, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, Colombia, Belize, the Florida Keys, and Costa Rica. And as of 2016, you can add Cayman to that list to make 20 countries. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition, Mr. Speaker, is asking what is the success rate. Well, if I can, for a moment, quote his leader, who said yesterday, "You think I can't anticipate people?" And while, Mr. Speaker, success had varied in these other 19 locations, the science is sound. The most successful coral relocation to date has taken place in Hawaii in 2005 in a place called Kanoe Bay, where they achieved a 90% survival rating and effectively transformed a previously dredged sandy area into a functional coral reef. And it is recommended, Mr. Speaker, that a 3 to 5 year period is recommended for adequate eco-stabilization, due mainly to the slow growth of corals. So Cayman won't be the first, Mr. Speaker, but we may yet prove to be the most successful. 90% in Hawaii, 2005, after 3 to 5 years. 89% success rate in the Cayman Islands, 2016 to 2017. We are poised to be leaders once again. But the science is sound, Mr. Speaker. This project, Mr. Speaker, like all government-supported projects, seeks to grow the economy, safeguard our tourism, and protect the interests of our people. Again, Mr. Speaker, my anticipation of some of these questions is almost uncanny. And I must be a magician. And it will do so, Mr. Speaker, to the member from Georgetown Central's question, without wide-scale destruction, but instead careful planning and design, which will enable the new pier to be built on elevated platform, thank you, Mr. Speaker, rather than a solid bulkhead, secured by pilings, which in addition to minimizing the impacted coral footprint, it will allow both the sea and marine life to live and move freely underneath. And, Mr. Speaker, it will allow sediment to maintain its natural flow without risking our beautiful 7 Mile Beach. As we see in Cayman Brac, Mr. Speaker, and also the current dock, the facility itself will act as a man-made reef structure, and the elevated platform will become a haven for juvenile fish that lends itself to supporting a healthy marine habitat. Yes, Mr. Speaker, this project is truly different than any project that has been proposed by previous administrations, and I think I say that without making too much of a stretch. Earlier, Mr. Speaker, I gave some numbers on the amount of dredging. Specifically, the change in the design has yielded a 31.3% decreased dredge volume, resulting in an 11.3% decrease on the dredge footprint. It is important to note, Mr. Speaker, that none of the dredge material from excavation will be thrown away, or more importantly, thrown over the wall, the west wall, but instead will be recycled and used for landside construction. Also, most notably, Mr. Speaker, no dredging will take place in Hogstye Bay proper. That means, Mr. Speaker, this so-called risk of silt or dredge material destroying popular reefs like Paradise and Eden Rock is a red herring, Mr. Speaker, a bluff, a deception, a ruse, Mr. Speaker. Nothing more than CPR subterfuge intended to scare Caymanians into believing that there is a threat. Keep listening, you learn something. While the exact dredge management plan, Mr. Speaker, is still in the process and will form part of the environmental impact assessment scoping works, which I'm told will begin shortly, after the VibraCore is completed. Don't worry, I had to ask what that meant as well. VibraCore is a process of vacuuming the seafloor for the testing of materials and sediments, so the developers can understand, as a matter of fact, what lies beneath and what substrate they have to work with. Some may remember back in 2016, before I arrived, a company by the name of Royal Haskoning out of Holland were selected by the Central Tenders Committee to undertake civil engineering design works which would lend itself to determining the best possible design for the berthing piers by achieving the least possible environmental impact. Well, in 2018, Royal Haskoning completed their survey and tendered a report which sought to inform the dredge management plan, which recommended a mechanical dredging approach rather than a hydraulic approach, which would lend itself to minimizing dredge plumes caused by turbidity. So what's the difference, Mr. Speaker, you might ask? Some in this House, engineers and the like, are well aware, but most are not. I wasn't, and I suspect those listening in aren't, so I will explain it. Mechanical dredging, Mr. Speaker, involves the use of an excavator or another type of heavy equipment, usually situated either on a barge or at the water's edge. Typically what we see in quarries across Cayman. To dig out the bed of the body of water and to extract the sediment and take it somewhere else. The sediment is then hauled away for either disposal or reuse. In contrast, hydraulic dredging uses suction to remove the sediment, which is then transported by high-pressure pipe and deposited somewhere else to be recycled. Since turbidity, Mr. Speaker, is viewed as the enemy, the suction method increases those chances and thus increases the chances for silt leakage. As part of the dredging process, Mr. Speaker, and the criteria set by this government, as part of the advice it received and paid for by Royal Haskoning, real-time turbidity monitoring and adaptive management techniques will be employed to ensure that turbidity levels do not exceed predefined thresholds. And when combined with the early warning notifications as part of this plan, it will allow developers to reduce their production rate, to reposition the dredge, or even suspend dredging altogether until such time that these plumes are brought under control. So these plumes of silt that the member from Northside suggested would consume Georgetown Harbor, whilst I think well-intended, and I certainly valued the contribution in which he provided to us yesterday, but I have to classify it as just simply more scaremongering. Mr. Speaker, this government has been careful to measure twice and cut once. Why? Because we live here too, Mr. Speaker. We have children and grandchildren that we hope to see grow up and prosper in this country.
Mr. Speaker.
Rising on a point of order.
A point of order, Mr. Speaker. Can the member provide this honorable House with the report he's speaking from so we can all have a view of it?
He's not reading from a report. He's making remarks from the report, but I haven't detected that he's reading. I think he has copious notes, and therefore is not, under the standing orders, don't have to lay any such report. If you read from it directly, then I am required to have one.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You are correct. I am not reading from anything, no report or otherwise. For the past 2 years, I have asked numerous questions. Remember, I came into this race and this seat in the House opposed to cruise berthing. And I asked every possible question that I could think of for the last 10 years, and then some, of the Deputy Premier, to the point that he got tired of seeing my face. I interjected myself in every single meeting as far as was possible, given the fact that I have 7 other ministerial responsibilities that take up a great deal of my time of the day, to learn why this project is different. And the reports, meetings with Royal Haskoning and otherwise were conversational, which, to the Speaker's point, I took notes for my own purposes, because I knew at some point in time I would be called on to explain What has changed? My opinion. Interestingly, Mr. Speaker, and perhaps as expected, much of the objections about the cruise berthing and port facility has been around the environment, with groups like Save Cayman, the National Trust, the Conservation Council, all getting in on the act, all with eyes on Hogstye Bay. However, Mr. Speaker, what I find curious is not a single comment, petition, or otherwise has been leveled at the approved $500 million in projects that have been approved by this government in the first 6 months of 2019, which include an unprecedented 380 development projects worth more than $500,000, and another 659 planning permits that are valued at about $205 million. Surely Cayman will lose a significant amount of flora in this exercise, Mr. Speaker, as we attempt to grow our economy for all to benefit. But yet, not a single word from our so-called environmental warriors on this subject, Mr. Speaker. This proves my point, Mr. Speaker, that those who stand opposed to this project do so for less than genuine intentions. And surely not because they believe, as I have heard one recent CPR ad say, the environment was given to us by God and therefore should be protected. The people were given to us by God too, and they deserve to be protected, Mr. Speaker. So what makes this relatively small piece of seabed so much more important versus the acres of landside development that make up these other 380 projects? Maybe someone can answer that to me when they rise. Moving on, Mr. Speaker, and finally away from the environment. Earlier I said that cruise berthing and port facility project will deliver no upland development. That means no competition to local merchants, protecting existing jobs while creating new ones. Jobs such as the one advertised by Verdant Isle as part of their job fair, which I understand is taking place today. Jobs that include field engineers, Mr. Speaker, divers, welders, carpenters, concrete finishers, equipment operators, both big and small, and common laborers. And that's just on the cruise port development side, Mr. Speaker. New jobs will also come available among the shops and souvenir stores, who will need to take on new staff to deal with the increase in cruise passengers these facilities will provide. Taxi operators will see improvements on their daily trips. Tour operators can expect an increase as well. According to PricewaterhouseCoopers, 1,000 new jobs in total can be expected to be created from this project. Ownership opportunities, Mr. Speaker, will come available as we seek to continue to develop new attractions and tours in order to keep our offerings fresh and exciting. The list goes on, Mr. Speaker. What about the pedestrian experience, Mr. Speaker? The Georgetown Revitalization Initiative will integrate their efforts with this project to provide improved traffic flows, sidewalks, better lighting, and additional parking downtown. They will rejuvenate Georgetown to its former glory, fitting of that of a nation's capital. As a result of the cruise berthing project, we see the Georgetown Revitalization Initiative, the National Roads Authority, and the Port Authority collaborating for the first time together to come up with a road transportation plan that will facilitate both the increased number of cruise passengers combined with the regular flow of business in downtown Georgetown. The cruise berthing facility, as the member from Georgetown West alluded, will allow the arrival of ships to be spread more consistently and will provide more space for our tour operators to meet passengers dockside, and the opportunity, since they don't have to stand in lines, to explore some of the otherwise restricted beauty of the Cayman Islands that prior to, they didn't have the opportunity. Beautiful Bordentown, beautiful East End, beautiful North Side. Parts of Cayman with a unique tourism offering that I would recommend to anyone. Mr. Speaker, the cruise berthing and port facility will grow our economy, just as the government has stated, by building necessary port infrastructure that will take the Cayman Islands into the next half century. And it will also see the development of enhanced cargo facilities, which will ensure essential goods arrive on time for every single person in these islands. Mr. Speaker, if the Cayman Islands, as a government, had to subsidize the cargo facilities, it would cost the country at a minimum $40 million. But instead, it comes part of the designed, finance, build, and maintain model being offered up by Virgin Islands. Cargo, Mr. Speaker, from food to building materials. Goods, Mr. Speaker, that will enable us to grow our economy, to create more jobs, to create more ownership opportunities for Caymanians in this important tourism sector and beyond. Mr. Speaker, when it comes to tourism, I believe you have been quoted in the past, correctly, I might add, by describing Cayman as not being the only pretty girl on the block, but instead has to compete with other pretty girls, or more specifically, other pretty islands with lovely beaches and cheerful people. Those other islands depend on cruise tourism, just like we do. But unlike us, they are developing and enhancing their assets to meet the growing demand of visitors in that sector. It is a fact, Mr. Speaker, that the cruise lines are phasing out their smaller tender vessels and replacing them with larger ones. The kind that won't tender but will only berth. How do I know this? Well, because the cruise lines have told us directly. I have sat no further away than you are to me from the president of the major cruise lines when they have said this, point blank. Mr. Speaker, in total, the Cayman Islands competes with 35 other pretty girls in the Caribbean, Mexico, South, and Central American region. And there are cruise piers in Antigua, Anguilla, Belize, multiple ports in Jamaica, including Falmouth, 2 in St. Croix, 2 in the Bahamas, and 3 in St. Thomas, including the most popular port, I think it's Charlotte Amalie, where they receive cruise visits almost every single day. According, Mr. Speaker, to the 2018 Cruise Industry Overview, published by the Florida Caribbean Cruise Association, for which I will now lay on the table of this honorable House. I have one copy, but I have already asked the page to produce multiple copies for every member, including yourself.
If you're going to read from it, I would rather have a copy.
Well, I'm going to only refer to it ever briefly, sir, from information that is contained on its multiple pages.
Not reading directly.
Not reading directly, sir, but quoting aspects of this report. According to the Florida Caribbean Cruise Association 2018 Cruise Overview, the total number of cruise ships passengers was over 27 million worldwide, up nearly 10% from 2 years earlier. Clearly, again, as the member from Georgetown West alluded, cruise is quickly becoming the preferred method of travel. And when planes are falling out of the sky with a degree of regularity, who can really blame them, Mr. Speaker? In the next 10 years, 106 new ships are expected to enter service, replacing their smaller counterparts. 50 in the next 7 years between 2018 and 2025. And currently, over 50% of the world's cruise fleet is based in the Caribbean for the winter, contributing some $3.1 billion in direct expenditure. What will this mean for Cayman, Mr. Speaker? That means an opportunity to see between a 25 to a high of 47% increase in the total annual cruise passenger numbers. This equates to an economic uplift to this country of between $200 and $245 million a year in revenue. Revenue, Mr. Speaker, and in particular, new revenue. You know, a lot has changed since my days as host of the morning and evening talk shows. Obviously, my position on cruise berthing is one of them. However, another change, Mr. Speaker, which I will volunteer, is my former underestimation of the value of revenue when it comes to managing the country's finances. I used to focus almost entirely on expenditure. Many will recall me saying we need not focus on the revenue column, but instead on the expenditure column. If we reduce that, we have more to spend. I used to say that we needn't worry about revenue streams. But expenditure, Mr. Speaker, does not show a complete picture of the state and overall health of our economy. Sometimes we have to spend money to make money, or such is the ethos in the private sector. However, government does not exist to make a profit. Instead, it exists to provide the right climate for business to grow and to succeed, and in so doing, provide full employment for our people. But largely, Mr. Speaker, the government is about providing services that our people need. Things like roads, schools, hospitals, mental health clinics, etc., etc. And because the Cayman Islands does not employ an income-based tax requirement, but instead earns its money from consumption or expenditure, i.e. the purchase of goods and materials and from the importation of the same, another good reason to invest in redeveloping our cargo infrastructure so that that flow of money can be maintained, if not increased.
Have you reached a convenient spot?
Mr. Speaker, if you give me 5 minutes, I will be done. In this context, Mr. Speaker, revenue, and in particularly new revenue, is important to not only maintaining a healthy economy, but also to provide protection against external forces outside of our control or otherwise shocks to our economy. And I need only mention the constant threat to our financial services industry, the primary contributor of GDP in this country, I think, to make this point. I need not go any further. Government services are more than just other infrastructure projects, Mr. Speaker. Largely, government's expenditure is about its people. And therefore, my previous ethos of cutting expenditures is more than growing revenue was, if not wrong, well, certainly not balanced, Mr. Speaker. And having seen firsthand in these last 2 years what it takes to keep this beloved island successful in terms of the role of government, or that which is expected of the government, revenue, and in particular new revenue, Mr. Speaker, is important to the Cayman Islands, and creating those opportunities are also the obligation of the government. An increase in $200 to $245 million every year into Cayman's coffers would go a long way to assisting government provide services to those most vulnerable. And while I believe the cruise berthing and port facility project creates the climate to replace welfare with opportunity, Mr. Speaker, allow me just a few moments in closing to highlight where the government monies go every year, and in particular in the past 2 years under this administration in an area that I know something about. Because the critics of CPR have also said this referendum is more than just being about the port, but instead have gone so far as to suggest this coalition government isn't doing anything to help our people. Well, frankly, Mr. Speaker, from my perspective, that agenda, that viewpoint is completely hogwash. In 2019, Mr. Speaker, the Ministry of Community Affairs, which as councillor I have shared responsibility for in support of the minister responsible, who in this case just so happens to be the Honourable Premier. The Ministry of Community Affairs will spend approximately $25.5 million by the end of the year on Core Needs Assessment Unit, or NEU, and Department of Children and Family Services, or DCFS, initiatives. Core NEU initiatives will reach about $14.2 million and includes things like rental assistance, utility assistance, food vouchers. An additional $8.6 million, Mr. Speaker, will be spent on permanent financial assistance for the elderly or infirmed, sometimes referred to as indigent. And I will admit freely that I don't care too much for that word, Mr. Speaker, but until we come up with a better one, it is what it is. As well as ex gratia payments for ex-servicemen and seamen. In fact, Mr. Speaker, this government of national unity has increased spending in these areas specifically over the past 2 years, reflecting a net increase in comparison to that which was spent in both 2016, before we arrived, and 2017, the first year of this administration's term. But where are we spending it, Mr. Speaker? We are spending it on the people. $500,000, Mr. Speaker, will be spent on Core Department of Children and Family Services family support, which include things like foster care and adoption, community development needs, elderly services, family services, youth intervention, youth justice, yes, and child safeguarding. It will spend a further $2 million to fund supporting the Pines Retirement Home as part of our residential care for the elderly and the disabled. It is clear, Mr. Speaker, in just this one ministry, we can see where government expenditure goes, and thus why it is important, Mr. Speaker, to move forward with the necessary infrastructure projects like the cruise berthing and port facilities in order to increase our annual revenue, to create jobs, to create opportunities, to create economic growth that, yes, spans way past just the average cruise visitor, but to services and needs of the people of these beloved Cayman Islands. The revenue needed to support these things has to come from somewhere, Mr. Speaker. And in Cayman, we have two options. We can tax our citizens, or we can expand our revenue base. This administration, like the former, have committed themselves to no new taxes, Mr. Speaker. And therefore, the only option available is to increase revenue. Mr. Speaker, I am fully confident today, 2 years later, that the Ministry of Tourism, led by the Honourable Deputy Premier, but also the entire coalition government of national unity, led by the Honourable Premier, have taken slow, deliberate, and careful steps with regards to this project, followed by established best practice and integrity in all its dealings to deliver a cruise berthing and port facility that will deliver the greatest economic benefit with the least environmental impact. And it will represent infrastructure that will be owned and operated by the people of the Cayman Islands. As such, Mr. Speaker, I intend to vote yes in the referendum, and I encourage the people of Prospect and the wider Cayman Islands to do the same. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
We will suspend proceedings until 1:15. 1:15.